Hello and welcome to the Nicole Murphy podcast. Today I'm going to be joined live by Mark Groves, who is the Create the Love account on Instagram. He is a human connection specialist and really has impacted my lives, and I know the lives of many others, with how he authentically, without bullshit, shares relationship advice, explores it with you, shares parts of his life, and he has a podcast called the Mark Groves Podcast, and it has thought leaders, experts, physicians, spiritual teachers. It really has the range of people that he's really curious, and it's so beautiful. I see he's coming on right now. Mark.
Hello.
Hello. Thank you so much for joining me today. How are you?
I'm good. I'm excited to be here.
I'm really excited to be here and on your Create the Love account.
Yeah, we are. What's up, Create the Lovers?
Yes.
We're doing our live. We're jamming with Nicole Murphy.
Yes. Hello. I am so grateful that you agreed to do this, because there's so much here. I've had so many friends. I've experienced this in my own life throughout the last few years. The most painful part of this whole pandemic has been relationships for them, losing relationships, losing people, because let's not discount that. People have been dying, and that's losing of connection. But one thing that people have come to me asking me about is, how do I navigate this? And of course, you're an expert, or maybe you wouldn't say that. You're a human connections specialist. So how do you go from being, for those who don't know, a pharmaceutical rep for over a decade, for 14 years, into talking about relationships, and then most recently, speaking out on what's going on in the world?
I mean, I was always obsessed with human behavior, but as a rep, it was more so from a manipulation perspective. I mean, really what sales is getting someone to change their behavior. So I was really obsessed with understanding that. I used to teach a consulting program, still do, but it just has more relational things now, called the Science of Influence. And, so I studied all that kind of stuff. And it was, that transition actually came from heartbreak in my late 20s. I was like, wait, I feel like I've not been taught what I need to know about relationships. Why have, I've been the way I've been? Why did I do things I actually didn't want to do? Like, that makes no sense to me. Why do some relationships last, others not? Why do some people stay together and hate each other? None of this made sense to me. I felt like I'd been sort of asleep all this time. And it was the first time I started to ask questions like, why do I do what I do? Why am I the way I am? Why am I here? I'd never thought about that. I read Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl. And that was the first time I ever thought, like, well, maybe I have a purpose beyond becoming a provider and making money and taking care of a family and having a white picket fence. And that got me into studying relationships. I went back to school, studied positive psychology. I obsessed over the science of relationships. Being a pharmaceutical rep, I was able to read clinical trials and understand research. I really loved doing that. So I started to do that in more of the social sciences. And that sort of led up to, oddly, I would have never thought that would have been sort of a very great background to really look at what's going on in the world today, and have that background in pharma and also have that background in relationships, and really see, I think, contrary to, I think, what a lot of people believe, when the pandemic first began, I saw the videos that everybody saw, people falling on their face. Those videos were coming out of China. And I was like, wow, I don't want to get this. This is serious business. There was just a number of flags that kept coming up for me. I've never been anti medications. I certainly am critical of the industry, which I think is actually a fair thing to be critical of, considering their long history of deceit. And I was a rep, so I launched drugs. I took drugs off the market. I worked with specialists. I knew how to launch drugs. I was very good at it. And so I was watching a launch of a product And I was very curious about the product. I was like, maybe I'm going to get this. Like, I don't know. I've never looked at the research on it. So I read the clinical trials. And I was like, this is being misrepresented somewhat. And the way that they were testing for, I'm just going to call it the C, because otherwise it'll flag. And I'll refer to the injection as the V. The way they were testing for it, I used to sell a product that used that PCR test. And so I knew that you couldn't use it for diagnostic purposes. So I was very curious about that. That became an orange flag for me. I'm like, because I knew about cycle thresholds and all the things. And anyone who hasn't studied the test, it's not hard to understand. But you realize that different labs are using different cycle thresholds. And if it's too high, then you'll pick up anything. And so you'll get false positives. And even Fauci is recorded saying that above a cycle threshold, I think he says of 35. So a lot of different places were doing really high cycle thresholds. So that was misrepresenting how many positives there were. I was also alarmed that why wouldn't they want to have accurate accounts of how many people are passing, like from it versus with it? Again, I've never been anti it. These were just things that kept adding up that I went, that doesn't make sense. And as a rep, you're not allowed to sell anything that doesn't have an indication for it. So I can't say this thing prevents injection or transmission, sorry. This thing prevents transmission if there's not a study that shows that, and then the government approves that message. Like it's indicated, it's approved for the reduction of transmission. And when I looked at the trials, I'm like, oh wait, they didn't even look at that. So they're saying that it does that. And then they used that information as a way to put in mandates and influence things. And so I saw the strain of this on my relationships, my friendships, my family. I saw it on that I was not critical of it, but questioning. I was still maintaining this, I would say it felt like a healthy level of discernment. Is this right for me? Do I want to take it? Let me look at the risk stratification. I take care of my health. Does it make sense for me based on the risk? I'm at higher risk of getting injured mountain biking. No one's telling me to stop mountain biking. And then when I started to see the moralization, I'm a good person, be a good person, do your part, I started to look at the messaging that was coming from public health. And I was just like, oh, wow, this is really manipulative. And I get it. Public health is supposed to influence behavior. They have what they call nudge tactics, and those have been highly abused. You'll see that data in the UK. Certainly Canada has used it. It's where they really weaponize fear. But what they did was that they really created division, and they really othered. And what that did was create a lot of splits in relationships, a lot of, well, you're not getting it, so you're not a good person. You're selfish. And then, oh wait, you got it, you're a sheep. So we it's not one side's right and one side's wrong. It's that both sides exist. And it's actually what I found very fascinating. I'll just stop my rant on this point.
No, it's great.
What I found really fascinating was that it is incredibly healthy to be hesitant to take any medical intervention, especially one that is experimental and all the things. But to actually make it so we were socialized to shame anybody who had any hesitation, that really was gaslighting, and that destabilized a lot of people because it's a healthy response, and now they're being told that their healthy response is actually not allowed. And so a lot of people experienced a lot of internal suffering because of that, because they had to turn off their intuition, their healthy response to any intervention. And if they were to say, I'm not really sure, they were called names. And, you saw that a lot in families, regardless of the side. You've seen a lot of division in that space.
So you mentioned that you did feel this in your family as well. As someone who studied relationship, understands how to communicate, and was questioning things, how did you approach those who were othering you or maybe gaslighting you? I
mean, I'd like to say I tried to do it well as much as I could. I was quite angry. I was angry because the Prime Minister of Canada was really perpetuating language that was othering. And, you know, if you look at Brene Brown's work, she talks about how dehumanization always begins with language. Because as humans, we can't harm people who are like us. And so what we do as a tactic, and if you look at history, this is what occurs. They use language to make it so we put this person outside of this group. And so now when they're outside of my group, I can now harm them. I might be more okay with policies that harm them. And you really saw this. You saw this a lot. And listen, I'm not saying that there's a perfect way to do public health, or I'm an expert in that. But what I do know is how language is used to divide and abuse. And so I'm just going to give an example of Justin Trudeau. So Justin Trudeau, before the vaccine, or we're done now. Before the passport came out, he said Canada will never be a place that would happen. And then when he did polls and saw that he might win a majority government during the election, he changed his tune completely. If you listen to him before and after, he's a completely different person. And his language is, you will not sit on a bus, a plane, a train beside someone who's gotten it. You who haven't gotten it, Canadians have done their part. All the language is really important because what it infers is belonging, and it infers collective agreement without there actually being a dialogue. And then he went on television on a French channel and he said, there's a small group, a fringe minority, and they're anti-science. So if you don't want to get it and you're hesitant because you're not sure based on your risk, it probably doesn't make sense. And I think the University of Western Ontario is dealing with their policy right now based on risk benefit. It doesn't make sense for a college student, but everyone else is allowed. Again, you're allowed to get it if you want to. That's the beauty of discernment. So I'm not saying there's a right or wrong choice. I'm just saying there's a choice. Wherever there is risk, there must be choice. And he goes and says they're anti-science. Okay, so now where there's no dialogue. If you're critical of it, you're anti it. That's not obviously true. And then he said they're often misogynist and racist. Do we tolerate these people? Now, what he's done there is a really interesting psychological trick, is he's unconsciously made it. So I now associate people who are questioning this intervention with groups we do not tolerate, misogynists and racists. He's not saying they are that, but he is saying that. And the sleight of hand in that language is that it makes us so we now go, oh my God, well, we now won't tolerate them. And if you look at how he uses language, that's right when mandates really kicked in. The real, like, Canadians aren't allowed to catch a plane if they're unvaxxed, but yet people who have gotten it and gotten the sea are flying in and just like giving it everywhere. You know, like that stuff that doesn't make sense is very destabilizing to the human spirit. And that's what happens in relationship, is they make you question reality, and that's in abusive relationships. So one real simple example of that is, and again, this isn't judgments on these things, I'm just discussing how it affects us, is restaurants. Wear a mask when you go in the restaurant. When you sit down, take it off. And if you go to the bathroom, put it back on. We all know that didn't make sense. And listen, the goodness of people, we went, okay, well, I'm going to do my part. Again, the language. I'm going to do my part. I want to keep restaurants open. I totally agree with that. I totally agree with that. We should, because I have friends who own restaurants. I have people who worked at restaurants. A few of those restaurants are now closed. And when we accept something that doesn't make sense, because people go, just do your part. And I'm like, but it doesn't make sense. And as soon as we start to do things that don't make sense, we do what's called mission creep, which is we start to normalize and desensitize ourselves to accepting things that don't make sense. And then the yardstick moves. But at this point, you know, Jordan Peterson, regardless of your opinions on him, he has a great statement where he says, I push you and push you and push you till you react. And then I stop. And then I push you and push you and push you until you react. And then I stop. But by the time we're done, you're way back from where we started. And if you look, a lot of this stuff doesn't make sense anymore. The science, we can argue with the, you know, the variance that the V was no longer as effective. All of that doesn't matter. What matters is that the reality of what is now and what has been true for quite some time is that we're really lost. And we're allowing things that don't make sense to actually run our lives. And it makes it so if we speak up, we fear that our family will cancel us, the internet will cancel us, that my community will cancel me. And what the government has done, which I actually see as a massive failure of public health. Again, not a public health expert, not saying that, but it is a massive failure, is that they have weaponized belonging, which of course is one of the tactics of nudge, is to actually create a sense of what is collectivism doing. And that's why we called anyone who didn't get it selfish, because there's a real reason in that. It was to like really shame individuation and sovereignty. And if you shame, I mean, look, it just, all of it is, it all builds upon the other thing, and it's actually quite psychologically destructive. So if you felt crazy in the last 2 years, if you felt like you had to get the intervention because you would have lost your job, or people were pressuring you, or you were shamed, that's actually coercion. That's actually a violation of informed consent. And I saw someone recently say, you can't compare it to Nuremberg. And I was like, but that's actually why Nuremberg was created. Like, that's actually why. And you know, when we look at history and we talk about history and some of the things that are familiar today to history, that's not the minimization of the experience of people in history. It's actually just saying, hey, there's some patterns that are kind of the same. And the reason we study history is so we don't repeat it. And so when will we be able to be critical of something and mean that we're not against it? And I think that's true of cancel culture today, is really it says you can't question anything. And if you do, you're a bad person because you're against that thing. But that's actually not how healthy relationships exist. You know, healthy relationships actually celebrate dissent and disagreement, because what it allows is for us to learn about one another. It actually deepens intimacy. You know, if I have a friend who's very pro the intervention, and I'm for it, but I'm not against it, you know, that I'm pro-choice about the intervention. I actually really want to understand what is driving their absolutism. And I would like to understand what is driving the shaming and fear-based of calling someone a sheep or a whatever. They're both fear-based responses. They're both afraid. One's likely afraid of dying, and really the public health messaging and the pandemic really amplified people who have anxiety about getting sick and dying. And it also made it so a lot of the policies are actually based on the people with the greatest amount of fear, which society can never really oscillate around that, because then no one would ever have freedom, and it would always be celebrated for our own good, which in history has always been the reason of the intention, or mostly the intention, of tyrants. So that was a long diatribe, but hopefully that all made sense.
No, it made perfect sense. And I want to go back because I'm sure you've said before too, it's like when we're in a family unit, we're at a family gathering, and there's that elephant in the room, and we all know something's off with the uncle or the aunt or whatever, but everyone stays silent because we just want to quote unquote keep the peace, but
Right.
there's no real peace in that
No.
experience. And I feel we're dealing with that on a global scale right now.
Yeah.
How does someone, because I want to go back, you were saying like, as soon as you are like, okay, this doesn't make sense, but I'll go along with it. I feel like it inches you further and further away from that alignment and that knowing. But how do people start to call it out from a place of compassion, not that fear-based sheeple place where it's just shaming?
Right. I mean, your point about family is interesting, right? Because most of our families and human systems orient around not confronting a truth. You know, you might have a person in a family who's an abuser that everyone knows is an abuser, or a person in a family who's an alcoholic that everyone knows is an alcoholic. But the actual whole human system is structured around surviving by hiding that truth. So everyone takes on a role: the perfectionist, the caretaker, the rebel. Everyone takes on a role. And so, you know, really being able to be curious, you know, what I didn't do well initially was that I was really angry. And in doing that, my anger, my nervous system was quite triggered a lot of the times. And because of that, I would record a video from that state. And of course, that would trigger someone else's nervous system. So I was creating the very division that I hoped to heal. That wasn't intentional, and I have compassion for what I've learned from that. And it's okay to be passionate and angry. And I think that anger changes worlds. You know, anger is a very transformative energy. And how do we confront, you know, getting back to your question, how do we be curious? I mean, that might be the hardest work, because if I'm open to your perspective, then I have to be open to mine changing. I have to actually be curious that I'm going to learn something from you. Because if you learn that your aunt, who has an autoimmune disorder, is actually super terrified, then you would have a lot of compassion for why they need you to get the intervention. And just by actually breathing a little space in there and being understanding, one might be able to then actually get into the data or into the facts. But you can tell when something's emotional. Someone could see all the facts in the world, you know, and they're not going to change it. Because what's happened, and this is true of human history, but this is especially true, I think it got magnified by the politics in the United States in 2016, but it's been true, you know, forever. Humans are tribal species. And so we really started to create our identities around our choices. And so, for example, when I was critical of the mandates and critical of lockdowns, which lockdowns have no evidence in history, they're an experiment that went way too long. And I was like, okay, 2 weeks, we'll see how it goes. But as it kept going on, I was like, this is going to cause more harm than it is benefit. And when I was critical of that, what I found was that people would call me right wing. I mean, I used to live in Vancouver. You're not even allowed to be on the right side. You get pushed into the ocean, you know, where conservatism goes to die. And I was like, wait, what? Like literally nothing I do is right wing. And that's why I think that there's a psychological protection that comes from calling someone anything, right wing, left wing, all that. And it's that I all of a sudden get to put you in a box. And I get to organize who you are. If you're right wing, you're probably racist. You're probably like Trump. You're probably like Pierre Poilievre. You probably, right? Like we just do all these things. And if you're left, you probably like Trudeau. You probably, you know, like we just go. And you like Biden. You know, like we have all these different perspectives. And what we're trying to do is organize the world. We're trying to make it more predictable. So we put it in these binaries. You're either this, you're that. You're either left or you're right. And then we put you're pro and crazy if you're left, and you're anti and crazy if you're right. And so it tries to organize the world. But what we do when we try to organize the world in that way is we actually remove nuance. And really that's where all of humanity lives, is in these grays between. That's why a lot of people watching might feel politically homeless today because there's not a voice that says, hey, can we talk about this? And I think a real failure of public health too, and politicians and medicine recently has been the lack of dialogue. It hasn't been modeled for us. What's been modeled for us is cancellation. What's been modeled for us is shame. What's been modeled for us is division. Like, they created this division as where a great leader unifies. A poor leader leads through fear and leads through division. And so it is our own individual work to be compassionate, to, you know, Jonathan Haidt, I was listening to a podcast he did recently on Barry Weiss's podcast, and it's called How Did America Get So Stupid in the Last 10 Years? And he says that, I think he's quoting his rabbi, who says that what lives beyond two opposing views is a third view, and it is seemingly wiser than the first two. And I think anyone who's experienced healthy relating can say that's definitely true. Am I open to being influenced by you? And are you open to being influenced by me? Really successful romantic relationships allow their partners to influence them and them to influence their partners. But look at how that's, like, what really happens when we disagree is we discover more about one another. But we have not been modeled how to disagree, you know, and I certainly, you know, I'm not all hate for what cancel culture represented, which was a correction of language and behaviors that were allowed to go that were toxic. But it pivoted all the way to this other end where it actually didn't allow space for restorative justice and restorative culture. And, you know, that's why in all of human behavior is trying to find our way back to the middle, which that means we have to live in the middle. That means we have to build bridges between the parts of ourselves that are in opposition, which I think is, I mean, that's the fucking work, isn't it? That's the work.
That's so true. And I want to just go off of what you're saying here. Lots of people have come to me and said, okay, I'm having issues with this relationship, whether it's because of division with beliefs or sides or whatever that means.
Yeah.
I know when a relationship has come to the fruition where I need to let go of it. And I lean towards anxiously grasping to every relationship.
Me too.
Versus being okay with it drifting, or reflecting that I might be in a program of cancel culture. I might be in a program that's been normalized in society over the last few years.
Yeah, I mean, I think part of it is in the exploration of how do we get to a place where we're like, should I stay or go? You know, it's kind of a similar, how do we know when we've hit the end? Can you disagree with someone and still love them? You know, I think we don't realize how to do that. You know, no one's modeled it for us generally. We often think that disagreement means a lack of love. What it also happens, and it's usually from our child state, is it creates a lack of safety. You know, like if you and I agree about something, especially that has been correlated to values, which is really what's happened, is we said, if you get this thing, then you have good values and you're a good person. And if you don't, you're not. But it's obviously not that simple. And what protects and preserves the ideology of the person who thinks you have to get it, and if you do, you're good, is righteousness. And so the people can't actually meet, you know, because there's a hierarchy that's inferred with righteousness. And, you know, I'd say that relationships that can hold disagreement, you know, like I can hold disagreement with people I love and say, I love you, and we don't agree on this, but I still love you. And that's true for me. And I think sometimes and that's work, like, don't get me wrong, I'm not like ringing from a pulpit here and saying that's a challenge, because what I realize is like, how safe is a relationship when you can disagree, because you actually know that it's safe. Like, I'm psychologically safe to express, and you're not going to go anywhere. You know, and so there's a few things that I think about this. One is that in romantic relationship, when we've sort of hit a space of growth, we can hold for a bit. but we can't hold forever, because what happens is we start to shrink. And it's not loving to stay small to keep anybody. It's actually not loving at all, because it's not loving to yourself and it's not loving to them. The other side of it too is that, listen, if someone can't respectfully dialogue and disagree, then it's impossible to have them in your life regardless of anything. So really, I think what the last circumstances of the last couple of years did is, one, show us a lot of systems that aren't operating well. Our political systems, our health systems, our infiltration of pharma into government and lobbying. I mean, here's these companies that have no liability for all the people that were harmed. Not to mention, the government and the media have actively participated in silencing anyone who's been harmed. And you got to also look at the craziness that if you die and you've had the C, it's instantly the C. But if you die or have a side effect and you've had the V, you got to go to every length to prove it. Now listen, correlation's not causation, but correlation is always the seed that leads us to more investigation. So with all that said, you'll know I think at first we have to get to the place where we realize that we can disagree in love, and we have to live that. And then we can get to the place of, these are the ways that I would like to dialogue because of my love for you. I want to be respectful and listen to you. So in order for us to have a productive relationship, here's the things I'm committed to. Are you committed to those things too? And the other person goes yes or no. And if they say yes, and then you say, listen, if you raise your voice or you call me a name or you do anything of that, I'm going to end the conversation. I still love you, but I'm only interested in creating a relationship with you that actually honors these values. And then you can lovingly know that you can let that go. And you could say, I'm always here to dialogue if you're committed to these things.
I think you hit the nail on the head there. It's the willingness to communicate, and not just from a surface place. I did a post a while ago that says agreement isn't intimacy.
No, that's a great statement.
Yeah, it's not intimate if you just have all the same beliefs and you feel like, oh, okay, I'm safe here because we have all the same beliefs. We have
Also boring.
It's boring. It's
like
boring.
You want to be in a relationship with yourself? Like,
right.
Like, I like that my partner doesn't agree. I like that she sees the world differently. I like that she is the one who challenged me on my nervous system response. I like that she's the one who's like, I know what you're committed to. Here's something you need to look at. And I'm like, fuck. It doesn't mean I like the feedback. I just know that the feedback feeds my evolution,
I think you're hitting something there too. When you're in a relationship that's about your evolution, about growth, you are expanding. You're not shrinking down. So how do we become aware of when we're shrinking in relationship?
You can usually feel that in your body, but that's having to return to understanding your somatic experience. Getting back in touch. And when I say somatic, I mean the feeling of the body. You're in a really beautiful relationship, no matter the type, when two truths can coexist and be accepted and no one is wrong, right? Like that you and I could see it differently, and that I don't see my way as right and your way as wrong, but I might be like, oh, okay, well, what's between us? Navigating all of this.
Yeah, what are some other characteristics of, in your opinion, beautiful relationships, no matter the kind?
I mean, they're first committed to truth, They're committed to at least exploring what is true. They're committed to telling each other the truth. And that's why I say, like, I might say to you, I feel like you're ignoring me. That's not true. In your experience, you might just be busy with work. But I'm sharing with you my experience. I could probably structure that sentence better, but I could say, I'm feeling a lot of space between us, and the story I'm telling myself is that you're ignoring me. And that, because I'm actually sharing that, what I'm saying is this relationship is a relationship that can hold my vulnerability, my needs. And a partner who learns how to receive that, because that's also work too, because you might make it about yourself, you might get defensive, but I work so hard, I'm doing this for the family, right? There's a lot of stories there too, and they're all okay. So we might say, I hear you, and I recognize that in your experience, there's been space between us, right? So there's an ability to dialogue. There's a willingness to explore what is the information that's being put forward, right? Like, I'm not just getting defensive. It doesn't mean sometimes I won't, but it's that I'm actually saying, oh, I want to understand your world. If you look at the Gottman's research, I mean, the greatest predictors of relational success are actually that kindness and respect are present. I think we can all agree with that. And I'd say maybe, at least in my experience, outside of truth coming ahead of everything, is, you know, like someone willing to say, I miss us, I miss you, I don't like the way I'm being, I don't like the way you're being. Anything that historically we would think threatens the status of the relationship. Like if I tell you the truth that I feel like you're distant or I feel this, then you might leave me. Well, keeping someone and honoring your silence is not helpful at all. As you said before, that just, it doesn't get rid of chaos. You just internalize the chaos. But I'd say the most important thing is a relationship that honors sovereignty and togetherness. So my father said this to me when I was far too young to understand it, but I'll never forget it. So obviously it left some imprint. He said that a relationship is a separate organism, and there is you and there's her in my circumstances, and then there is both of you. And this is true of all relationships, by the way, that all relationships honor the self. And they say, I want you to be all that you can be. I want you to feel self-expressed. I want you to pursue your dreams. I want you to become everything you can be. And when I honor that in you, I also ask that I honor that in myself, because I'm going to live those values within me. And so I think I think it's Rumi, or I can't remember who the poet is, but essentially the message is that all relationships are just two sovereignties bumping up against each other. And most of us don't know how to be ourselves and be in a relationship. We're usually in a relationship at the cost of ourselves, or we're losing the relationship for us. Do you know what I mean? So the relationship becomes the cost, or the self becomes the cost.
Right. And if you're in a relationship, would you not want your partner to be all that they can be? That's only going to benefit you. So when you're wanting any relationship, when you're wanting someone to shrink down or not be fully expressed, maybe that's a bit of a warning sign. And I feel like we've seen that in society. It's like, you're not allowed to question or express, you know, any discomfort you might have around this, else you're just a bad person.
Yeah. I mean, the codependency celebrates self-abandonment. And if you look, that was also what can be exploited, which is people who will self-abandon for the collective. So I will silence my voice because I don't want to be seen as too much or selfish. I'll silence my choice because everyone else is doing this, and I'm just going to be seen as a selfish prick. So yeah, I mean, I think we're all, you know, if you think about how government often works and media works, is they say, you aren't adult enough to make a choice, so I'm going to decide what information you get. Look at fact checkers and misinformation. Anything that disagrees with the narrative is considered misinformation. I did a post not long ago where I was saying, listen, I'm all for the accuracy of information, but I've seen many a politician and many a public health official say something that's not true about the V, and that not get a flag on it. Why doesn't that get a flag? Anything that promotes the use of the product never gets a flag, even if it's wrong. See, to me, that shows you that there's a very bias, because I think you should question anything you're not allowed to criticize. That should be a big fucking red flag.
Completely. I want to go back a little bit because I'm just having this question pop in my head. There's a lot of talk in relationship and in a society to serve, right? We serve each other. How do you know when your service is an abandonment versus true service to the collective, to your relationship?
That's such a great question. You know, I think that's, again, discovering self. It's easy for me to say to someone, that's self-abandoning. But I'm not in someone's experience. So usually we recognize self-abandonment after, you know, and we might learn about self-abandonment or people-pleasing. Am I willing to silence and get rid of my voice to keep the peace? That's a great sign that we're prone to people-pleasing if we did that as a child. You know, Gabor Mate talks about how all humans have two needs. We have the need for belonging and connection, and we have the need for self-expression and authenticity. But when self-expression and authenticity threaten belonging, belonging usually wins. So that being able, when we haven't had a self, you know, and there could be a lot of pathology as to why that is true, then actually discovering a self and drawing a line around who we actually are is really powerful and hard work. I mean, it's challenging because, you know, I might ask someone, what do you need? What do you want? And they're like, I don't know, because no one's ever asked them that. Their life has been around other people's needs. And we've certainly socialized women for that. And we've socialized people to people please. And how do you know? Well, a great question that my friend Dr. Alexandra Salman asks is this my trauma or my truth? Like, to start asking ourselves that question. And what we'll start to hear, we'll start to connect in our bodies to, like, oh, that's trauma. That's like, I don't actually want to do this. Or, oh, that's actually my truth. And we just start asking ourselves that question. And if we do something and then we get the information after, we're like, oh, that was self-abandonment. So you kind of gather it as you go, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it makes perfect sense. So how did you start to speak out? Because I'm sure that wasn't easy for you. And I don't know, I think I did tell you this behind the scenes, but it was you speaking out that actually was a huge catalyst for me to speak out. So thank you for that very much.
Well, yeah, for the people who are from Create the Love, maybe express a little bit of what was your experience and what happened.
Yeah.
Because I
Yeah,
know that's significant.
It is. So I was actually working at a post-secondary level, instructing and mentoring media students. I went to school for news. So I love the media industry. I've worked with a lot of people who are working in mainstream media. I've worked in mainstream media at one point, and I'm surrounded by all these instructors who taught me certain things about watching for news, not putting adjectives, showing both sides, and it's not being done, and nobody's saying anything. And everybody is in fear and there's no discussion. And I spent 4 years teaching students, how do we get in touch with our own bias when we're doing media? And so it finally got to a point where I didn't feel like my whole body was crawling, like I couldn't not speak up. But then you spoke up, and I don't know if this is good, bad, right, or wrong, but I was like, Mark Groves thinks through things a lot. I'm not crazy.
I don't know if everyone would agree with that, but yeah.
Yeah, well, and I'm really, really lucky. I have friends and family. And my dad he was on to what was going on quite early.
Yeah.
So he, like, you know, yeah, we were all in it. But when you spoke out, I finally was like, oh, yeah, I need to do something. And I need to be okay. It's much like a relationship. I need to be okay with losing my job, because the pain and the abandonment that's taking place is worse. It's worse.
Yeah, the cost of that is so high, and we don't often realize that till the cost is manifested in inflammation and illness and all the things. It's powerful, and I'm just so inspired by what you've been willing to lose and gain in order to self-express. You know, I never really thought about at first whether I was speaking out, because it was just normal for me to talk about the things that were going on in the world. And I interviewed a friend of mine who's a physician in New York, and he talked about all the risks and here's what you can do. And so that was very early on. So I was very proactive about just people experiencing being educated about what they can do. When I saw things being censored, when someone talked about the immune benefit of different interventions that are natural or exercise, or I was like, wait, we're censoring that? Or the cancellation of natural immunity? I mean, that's crazy. Honestly, some of the stuff is so bananas that you actually have to take your brain and throw it in the garbage to even make it make sense, because you can't. Again, it's all so destabilizing. So I think actually it was just more so that I was really feeling the social pushback And I do think I needed to sort of recoil and go into somewhat of a hibernation to like really sort out what I felt and what I wanted and who I was and what I stood for. And, you know, I just started, it's just the evidence just built up so much, like it's not able to deny. And I think now coming back, you know, I created a separate Instagram, called it Smart Groves, and I talked about, really it's very focused on the science. You know, like I want to share the studies that you don't see in the media. I want to speak out against the bias that is the media. You know, I've always had a deep respect for the media. But in the last couple of years, I'm like, wow, you've really contributed to the division. It used to be your job to criticize the government, and now you are an arm of the government. And I've really felt very abandoned by the media, which that sounds very internal, but I just feel like, wow, like you've perpetuated, you amplify messages that are hurtful and divisive, but you don't do anything to unify, you know, and that has been really painful to watch. Because I'm like, fucking bullshit. Like I saw them publish, I won't even get into the data because it's so bad, but a mathematical model that doesn't even take in waning immunity. It was such a bad, poor mathematical model. And you saw every single news outlet in Canada, not really anywhere else because it was a Canadian study, saying that the unV'd put the V'd at risk. It was literally the worst study. It wouldn't pass peer review in a normal world. And I saw every single news outlet amplify that. And I went, you don't realize the harm you're doing. Like you're harming families, you're harming communities, you're harming individuals who feel crazy, who are like, wait, now, because it just kept creating more hate. And it just wasn't balanced. And that's where I was like, they need to be called out and held liable for the perpetuation of hate speech, for the perpetuation of division, for the harm. I hope there's a massive class action lawsuit that goes after the government and goes after the media. And, you know, media outlets like Rebel News, which I think could use a better name, you know, it's not the ideal branding, but, you know, are just automatically called right wing. But you look like a large percentage of the US population watches Fox. And more people watch and listen to Joe Rogan than any of them. And I think most of them added together, you know, I mean, people were very critical of Joe Rogan. They call him a right wing, but he's only ever voted Democrat. And they called Russell Brand right wing. He was one of their the right wing. Russell Brand is so far left.
I know. I did a whole thing the other day. Like I said, if you would have told me when I was in new school that I would trust Russell Brand.
Oh, right.
Like 10 years ago, if you say you're going to go to Russell Brand for news, I would have thought that's crazy. And you're hitting the nail on the head about something else. So like media, mainstream or alternative, they function, a lot of them, on making your nervous system go crazy. If it bleeds, it leads. It's not just
to that, yes.
It's not just mainstream. It's alternative as well. So I was like, I've been sitting back for a while going, how do we create media that empowers, not from fear, but actually get people aligned, not.
And both sides do it. You know,
both sides do it.
That's interesting though, because I think like when you think of the nervous system and how people respond, you know, like ultimately what social media platforms do and what media do, as you said, they dysregulate us. And the whole job of a social media platform is actually to keep you on here. So there are literally teams of hundreds of experts who design these little like buttons and shares and reels. They design them to capture you. So if you think about it, the way that Instagram is designed or TikTok is designed or Facebook, I'm not saying all of them, but a lot of them, is they're designed to keep you on here so they can get more advertising to you, so they could sell more ads, etc. Now, what's really interesting is that anyone who creates content on social media, when an algorithm says we're only going to celebrate reels, what inevitably happens is the creator goes, well, I got to create reels because they're not doing anything with my static posts and my business is on here. And think about that. and I'm not saying every person, but most people, they start to then create what the algorithm celebrates. And so they already are splitting. And I'm not saying there's not great reels or there's not great dancey pointy videos, all that shit. And there's not great videos of, I don't know if anyone's watched like kook slams. Like that shit's hard to watch, but it's funny. There's, what it does though, is it makes it so that we create content that keeps people on it. And so we actually become conduits of extraction. So we actually become the vehicle that the social media platform uses to get people to stay on. So no wonder we feel more anxious, more depressed, more stressed, because we are literally being extracted from in order to extract from other people, which when you think about that, that's fucked up. But what they are monetizing is your attention. And when they turn down the volume on anything that gets attention, even, because of course people are craving like discussion. They're craving truth. They're not craving, I mean, maybe some people are craving dancey, pointy videos, which I think are great. I mean, don't get me wrong. That's cool if that's your jam. But I do think that it's a very interesting that if we were to make news that didn't activate the nervous system, would anyone watch it?
So I was working for the Pulse, and that was the
Yeah.
whole purpose. And we had this discussion all the time because it's tough. It's tough to create news that doesn't, like, if it
Right.
bleeds, it bleeds. Now, they do, in this book called Contagious, they do talk about a high arousal emotion like awe. People
Oh,
really...
that's true. Like videos of sunsets and you see people doing surfing or something. That's true.
Yeah, so, and awe is a beautiful thing. So how do you, and positive psychology has its place in news. There's a book called Broadcasting Positivity. I believe that's what it's called. There's a place, but I mean, you know about marketing and sales and influence. Where's the line between being manipulative versus being influential?
I mean, it's a delicate line. Who gets to choose what that is? You know, because some people would say the public health, they're just doing the best they can, which I argue they're not. That's actually a lie. That's being nice to them. That's not holding them accountable. You know, we talked about capacity and never once did we put money into expanding capacity. We talked about, we fired nurses and healthcare practitioners who didn't get the intervention. And then but I thought capacity was an issue. And wait, the ones who got it still got the C and spread it. So it didn't make any sense. So if we were really worried about capacity, we'd expand capacity. We could have taken millions of dollars, hundreds and hundreds of millions that we put into nudge tactics, marketing, public health message. We could have actually put it into expanding hospital capacity. But what we actually did was constrict capacity by firing people and trying to manipulate them into getting an intervention that a lot of them didn't need because they had natural immunity, you know. And that's, again, like, this is, if we were to just broadcast positivity, would people do it? Probably not, because most people are traumatized, you know. And because of that, that trauma, that collective trauma, people are very prone to going deeper into the fear, deeper into the, what's the solution? What's the solution? How do I control my circumstances to minimize the potential that I die, or the potential that something happens, that my fears get realized? Which, again, like, yeah.
The positivity thing, it's not like, I think there is spiritual bypassing that happens with certain kinds of positivity.
Yeah.
So it's not pretending what's taking place isn't not taking place, but I think there's like a need to be right. So people dig deeper into the fear. It's like, I need to feel that self-righteousness. So if I actually just take care of my physical health, like marketing could have gone into information around health, physical.
Oh my God. Exercise, health. Most people put on weight, you know, and we know that weight, it contributes to outcomes. And if you spoke about that, that was considered, you know, ableist or not body positive. But telling the truth about something is not about creating shame or creating emotions for people. I think that's a misconception we have, is that we want to protect people from experiencing the shame that might come, or the pain or the emotion that might come from understanding a truth of circumstances. But when we protect them from experiencing the truth, we're not liberating them. And that sounds kind of righteous in the sentence structure, but what I'm saying is that we have to actually just tell what's true, you know, and to be balanced. All I've wanted this whole time is balance. All I've wanted is someone to say, hey, you could take it, but there's also risks. Or, hey, you know, like, it doesn't stop transmission. So, hey, if you're going to have Thanksgiving, you don't need to exclude someone, because that's not actually scientific, but it's very divisive. Again, it's that othering, it's the dehumanization.
Amazing. I just want to ask a couple more questions. I know that you have a very full life, but there have been people who come to me and they're like, I got cut from family dinner. These things have happened.
Yeah.
And now it feels like people are just going back to pretend, but nobody's talking about what happened. What advice would you give to somebody who was cut from family dinner or cut from a friend group, and now there's like this energy of pretend happening?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, that's tough, because you think about if you had a betrayal in a relationship, like cheating, in order to move through it, you would have to clear it and really discuss the betrayal. You'd atone. There's a lot of things that go into it. You'd rebuild the trust. I mean, yeah, I definitely experienced that. If I talk about something on social media, someone will say, isn't this over? Like, why are you still talking about this? And I'm like, oh no, like people need to be held to account for what's occurred, and the misuse of emotion and fear and the weaponization of it. I do think that it's appropriate to say, like, hey, I just needed to clear with you. This didn't make sense. I'd like to understand your perspective more. Why did you choose that? Did you ever consider the impact that it would have on me? Can I talk to you about that? Can I hear the impact it had on you? You know, because if someone's excluding their family member, that would have a significant impact on them too. And we might not really recognize that. In our anger and rage, we might not have compassion for that.
It's a beautiful answer. What would you tell people who got the jab because they wanted to keep their job, or they genuinely thought it was good and then had a massive adverse reaction? And I don't think people on the alternative side realize how much shame and pain can come around that. What would you tell people going through that?
Well, listen, I think every decision we make is the best decision we make at the time. So we can go back and replay our lives and say, I should have done this, I would have. But you know, regret is a prison. Regret is a prison that stays stuck in a loop of a moment, hoping for a different day today, but not dealing with today, not expanding from the awareness that comes with the pain. I'm not minimizing it in any way, because I couldn't imagine what it's like to go through something like that. I know I'm not a doctor, so I can't be like, oh, you got to go do this, this, and this. I think there are detox protocols out there. I think there are different places that you can get support. The one thing that I have seen that is challenging to witness is that people who have had side effects have been gaslit, and they don't have a space. And I think there's a fear there. One, liability payouts. I think investigating them leads to the possibility that they're true. Easier to just cancel someone or dismiss them. And I'm not saying everything is a side effect that happens after it. As I said earlier, correlation is not causation, but correlation it's always an invitation to look at something. I think there's a little too many convenient things that have happened after this mass intervention that we can't deny. And I think that information, much like excess mortality in young groups that aren't at risk, is really showing to us that we should look at that. So for someone who made that choice and might make a different choice today, I'd say actually go into the pain and anger of feeling coerced, and then hold the people who coerced you accountable from a legal perspective or a public perspective. It's important that we do that, because if we don't speak out against the coercion, then it can continue. And there are groups, really awesome support groups to help people with all of these things. And I'd say go find your people. Find people who are speaking out, find lawyers who are representing people, and gather all the evidence you can, and do what you can to change things moving forward.
Beautiful. What's the biggest lie you once believed?
Oh man, that's such a good question. That probably that pharma could solve everything, that it was only a force for good. And there certainly are medicines that have changed people's lives and saved people's lives. Because I'm not all about throwing out allopathic medicine. I think it serves a place. But I used to believe in the arrogance of humanity that we could solve everything, cure everything, do everything. And what I'm learning more and more is that there really is this need for all of us. I think, I'll speak to my experience. I think a lot of people have felt it, is this yearning to connect back to nature, this yearning to connect back to village and community. And that lie that if we treat the symptoms, it'll be fine. I realized that so much, what got me out of pharma and into relational work was just seeing that as I learned more about emotional dysregulation and conflict and challenges, I saw in the research that one of the greatest causes of inflammation is emotional dysregulation. And inflammation is what leads to disease generally. So I was like, wait, we're not talking about divorces and emotional conflict. And, I'm like, that's everything. Like if we could heal and teach people how to regulate their nervous system, how to change the environment and the circumstances and the inequity that creates that, and also give more resources to people, but also teach people how to grow their own food. We could all be eating organic from that space if we have, of course, if you have an apartment, grow it on the patio. Like there's so many things we can do. I just interviewed a guy who was saying that in 5 days, you can grow a full serving of broccoli sprouts. For 25 cents a day, you could eat a broccoli sprout salad that you can grow in a mason jar. And I was like, what? And you could grow that on your counter. And I was like, wow, this is the stuff we need to know. And I'm here for it. I'm here for that change, that transition, and really doing my best to participate in dialogue. And I'm not always going to get it well. I'm not going to do it well. I'm not going to get it right. But we all have to be willing to take the risks, as you are. And thank you so much for having me on your platform, because we have to take the risk to say things in a way that have never been said and to do things that have never been done. Because that's what opens the gate for everybody. It inspires everyone. When I see someone else speaking up, what I'm unconsciously experiencing is that my social risk goes down because other people are speaking up. And I think there is this, we're really at a critical mass, and it's happening. And I think if we can navigate this with grace and compassion and speak out, that's it.
I love that, Mark. Thank you. How do people find you? A lot of them are here because they follow you on Create the Love, or it's Mark Groves. But what are you doing right now? How can they work with you more?
You can find me here. I'm now doing more retreats because I just want to be in person with people. I think that's going to be just like the future for it. I just crave it, and I think we're all craving it. You can find me on Create the Love on this Instagram. You can find me on createthelove.com. That's where all my courses are. I have a podcast, the Mark Groves Podcast. So yeah.
And I just want to thank you again for your podcast as well, because you bring on people of different ideas, things that you don't necessarily agree with all the time, but you're really, really willing to explore and venture into truth. So I really appreciate that.
Thank you. I appreciate you and all of you're doing this in a very public forum, and you're pursuing what you value in terms of media and communication. And what I think is interesting about everyone who's taken the risk and lost a job or something like that, which is not minimizing it, is they inevitably find their passion and their purpose and their voice. So to everyone watching, that's the best thing you can do, is just say you're not okay with it, or just begin to speak up, whatever it's about.
Thanks
for having me, Nicole.
Thank you, Mark. Have a great day. And yeah, we'll talk soon, I'm sure.
You too.
Bye.